Today, it's vital that we discuss, sort of as a capstone to all of the things that have been done this morning and this afternoon, why all Christians need to educate their children classically and confessionally, not merely Christian. This goes for every single level: primary, secondary, and higher ed. There are arguments to be made for some level of specialization at some point in a person's education, but this argument centers around raising children and young adults in a classical and confessional school or homeschool, if that's what your context dictates. Christians need to educate their children in a way that actually teaches them the Christian faith. As Solomon says, train a child in the way he will go, and he will not depart from it. Now, before we get into the meat of it, who has attended government education for K through 12th? Good. All the classical kids are gone, so we got a couple left. What about homeschool? Okay. Classical? See, few. Now, children and grandchildren. How many of you send your children or your kids send your grandchildren to government school? Okay, good. How many of your neighbors? How many homeschool their own kids or their kids homeschool their grandchildren? How many of you send your kids to a classical school? Okay, good. So one, it lets me know what jokes you'll find funny. Two, it helps me, once we're done, anticipate some questions. Because this school is real, the paper is really focused on schools. So just take everything I'm saying and you have to do all the work if you're a homeschooler. So you can't make your teachers do it or give it to a secretary or administration. But I live in a school, essentially. So everything's going to sound like that. But it can definitely be applied to a co-op, to a homeschool, if that's where you find yourself. So again, I'm from Long Island. I went to public school, K to 12, and then Lutheran schools, but they're still public in the progressive sense. I mean, even our seminary education has its fingers in progressive education. So most of my education, if not all of it, was non-classical. Like most of you, unless you were raised in a classical school, we were converted at some point to understand education and the world differently. So when I make my arguments, I make them as an outsider who's come in, not as someone who was raised in it, right? Most people don't expect Lutheran pastors from Long Island, New York, and certainly not conservatives from New York, right? So then you add classical on top of it, and it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And the funny pronunciation of words. So, all right, classical and confessional, the urgent need for an education that teaches the faith. When much of the world shut down in March of 2020, the consequences of the decision were unknown by most. Even if some anticipated what would happen, the extent to which the world would be changed was unforeseen. Teachers and students, regardless of their school, went online for at least 2 months across the country. Teachers tried to survive the final quarter, but everybody knows the anecdotal evidence and the statistics. Children lost that quarter of the school year. Most in government school lost the next year on top of that quarter. And many places, you find students who are 1 to 2 years behind academically. Anxiety and depression have been driven through the roof due to the instability of education in the classroom and the reliance on digital technology that some families were trying to avoid and then had no choice but to bring whole hog into their house. While online, parents were flabbergasted at what their children were learning and what they weren't learning. Education had changed in their experience quite a bit. The content, the methods, the philosophy looked different. Homeschooling certainly has expanded, and private parochial schools grew tremendously. Our school doubled the first year of COVID in the day school population due to these things. But what we saw during COVID is the tip of an iceberg that has been lurking since before the Titanic. It is a very old iceberg. Education in America didn't change overnight, and it wasn't the fault of the 1960s. The rise of critical theory and its place in textbooks didn't happen instantaneously over the past 2 years. Education, both public or government and private and parochial, have used state certified teachers and have propagated and proliferated a worldview that is contrary to the Christian faith and the Christian life. Christians cannot trust the old ways to educate their children. Pick your generation: the lost, the greatest, the boomers, the Gen Xers, the millennials, Gen Z. All of them have been raised in ways that are contrary, even if some of you had a couple teachers that held on to older things. You can't escape it unless there's someone in here who was born in 1880 and happens to have done the transhumanism thing, right? It's the only way. All of us have been taught in some way that has led our whole society to this point. This past June, I've got a couple of books that you could probably buy. This book came out, Battle for the American Mind. Now, I'm a Lutheran, so I would have written a different ending. But this book is an excellent introduction for anybody, especially red-blooded Americans who love their country and love Jesus, to show them what has been wrong with our educational system and every school, right? Lutheran schools, Catholic schools, evangelical schools, certainly government schools. That's the second part of this book. I received no royalties for all the times I've mentioned this in the past 3 weeks, at Bible class, at teacher training, but you should read this or listen to it. If you have book studies, I would study it with elders, with parents. This book is a really great way that if you're not already convinced, you will be by the time you're done. And this is good for bread and butter people who aren't going to sit and read this, right? Liberal Arts Tradition by Clark and Jane. Good book. Again, I would have written it differently. I'm a Lutheran. But this is conversational, easy to work through, says the same thing over and over and over again. So you remember it. So Battle for the American Mind, I've borrowed some on that handout. I used it at a teacher training. I'm not going to talk about the handout, but it's meant to sort of substantiate what we're doing here. So it's a New York Times bestseller. If you live in a city or a town with a Costco, you could actually buy it there. It's on the rack next to the clothes, across from the free samples. So it makes the argument that's been made by homeschoolers and confessional pastors and like-minded parents for 40 years. Hegseth's view is that the worldview of the West, which he calls Western Christian paideia, which was the worldview of America's founding fathers, of the Western world before the Enlightenment, has been systematically extinguished here in America throughout the last century. It's been replaced by a progressive worldview, or progressive paideia, which has opened the door for further worldviews like the Marxist paideia. That's just a riff on the first one. So I'm not going to rehash the book. You can listen to it on Audible or buy it or read it, but it's definitely worthwhile. Every school you know of, unless it's unabashedly classical, Christian or otherwise, elementary, secondary, higher ed, it's been affected by progressive education. John Dewey, Horace Mann, Theodore Roosevelt, they all had a hand in implementing a worldview that pushed Christendom to the fringes of the classroom. Religious education time is the fringes of the classroom. Prayer outside is the fringes of the classroom. Now, how long God will permit America to endure is not a question we will ever know the answer to, even if you want to guess. But as long as he is merciful in permitting this great country to exist, we ought to work. As far as education goes, while there is time, the answer is to restore, revitalize, and rebuild classical Christian confessional education inside our communities. It can't be done in the government school. It can't be done in public or charter. It simply won't work. Hegseth makes the point, I'll do the same today. It has to be a Christian education in order to be classical. And my point is it has to be confessional. It can't just be loosely Christian. It needs to be Lutheran. It needs to be Reformed. It needs to be what you pick yours. Maybe your administration will pick it for you. And then you pick the school for your family that you can sleep well with at night. But it needs to be consistent. It can't just be Christian. If you unhinge classical pedagogy and content from the Christian faith, it's like separating the soul from the body. The mystery of the incarnation of Christ Jesus teaches us many things, and one of these things is that our Father in heaven cares for both body and soul. Otherwise, Jesus wouldn't have both. He has redeemed both your body and soul by the death and resurrection of Jesus. So our education needs to be for soul and body, for here and eternity. It needs to be classical and confessional. A classical Christian education is one which inclines students to seek wisdom in a lifelong search for the greater meaning in life, and it does this by studying history, by studying the classics. It teaches the application of reason. It teaches divine order exists and is revealed in Jesus. It trains strong-spirited citizens who are better together. It's not about looking for jobs. It's not about seeking facts. This kind of education is progressive education, and it's found in Christian schools. It's found in public schools, in charter schools. Through this curriculum, it's been used in various forms over the past century. Our students have been taught that there's nothing worth knowing that wasn't just thought of. Think about public libraries as an example of this. And school libraries, everything has to be new. It must be reprinted, new editions, and so on and so forth. And our students, and us included if we went to these schools, have heard countless sermons from their teachers on acceptance, on how the only order now is a humanistic anarchy. And they've been trained to be weak-spirited citizens who serve the state. A good example of that is the early 20th century replacement of history with social studies. A big problem, in all honesty. A classical education hands over the liberal arts, the freeing arts of language and mathematics. They are taught as subjects and as skills: grammar, logic, rhetoric, the trivium, the English, the language arts, and arithmetic, astronomy, music, and geometry, the quadrivium, the mathematical arts. This also is how we can defeat STEM and STEAM, because we've had them all the whole time, and we don't need to change acronyms every 5 years to fit with a fad. In a classical education, students read and discuss within the great conversation of the Western tradition. We do this in history, in literature, in philosophy, and theology. We teach Latin and Greek. All of our students sing, and they all play instruments, at least at our school. And they often have plenty of recess. My high school students love me for this, because we have recess every day, no matter how old, every day. And there's plenty of time for rigorous physical activity, not just sort of sitting around outside. Now, there are places for nearly every subject people are used to when you think about school and a classical education. The difference is that a classical education is holistic and general. Everything is interconnected. It is not segmented in subjects that way. The liberal arts provide the framework for students to have a robust general education in that which should be known in order to, in the future, specify, academic or otherwise, in serving their neighbor. It is a classical education that shapes the love and affections of the faculty and the students, just as it trains the body and the soul, but it must be Christian to actually accomplish its chief end, which is making children wise to salvation in Christ Jesus, equipping them to love their neighbors as themselves. There's a lot of talk about classical Christian education. It's become CCE. There are conferences every summer that speak to the philosophy in general, the application of it in particular. There are fellowships, there are cohorts for board members and school heads and teachers and homeschoolers. There's an online education platform Classical Academic Press gives called Classical U. You can get video content, become a certified teacher at home or in your school. I'm a Lutheran pastor. I'm a Lutheran teacher, and I often give a paper on how it has to be classical Lutheran education and not classical Christian education. So, full disclosure. Um, but I've been asked to be a little more ecumenical today. So, I'll try a little. The argument needs to be that we have to be classical and confessional. Our schools need to teach the content of Western civilization, and they should do so in allegiance with a Christian confession. Generic Christianity in the ecumenical and non-denominational sense is honestly a bit too amoeba-like for a Christian classical school. Because at some point, a bias has to be applied to teach Christian theology and history and everything else. And it will be applied whether the school is non-denominational or not. It's going to be applied. So you might as well be honest about the bias that you're using in your school. At the close of this paper, we'll look at 3 confessional traditions in the classical movement and what they're currently doing. We'll look at the Reformed via Doug Wilson. We'll look at the Roman Catholics with a Houston example and Wyoming Catholic College, and then Lutherans with the CCLE and Luther Classical, which I didn't actually know was going to be here. So if you were here yesterday and today, you get bookends, I guess. Each of these has an impact in the movement, whether it be through establishing colleges, hosting conferences, supporting brick and mortar schools. There is no Christianity apart from true doctrine, writes Eli West in summarizing the position of J. Gresham Machen on the confessional nature of Christian education. That's found in this book, Reforming Classical Education. It's a very, very recent volume. Got some very interesting, thought-provoking articles. One of these is on confessional education. West's article highlights the confessional concerns in the implementation of classical Christian education by drawing on J. Gresham Machen and Abraham Kuyper, both in America and in the Netherlands, at the early part of the 20th century. Public education in the Netherlands and public and Christian education in the States handed over a religious education that taught nothing of confessional or creedal Christianity. Dutch public education attempted to deliver, quote, a Christian education without sectarian differences. As a result, they stopped speaking in Christian terms. They didn't use words like sin or grace. This continued to the point where Kuyper wrote, the demand to respect all convictions prevented teachers as well as students from protesting against the atheist, but it did not go so far as to spare the sectarian hatred of believing Christians. Christians became comfortable with the system, and they believed what they were taught in government schools. Wait, that's about the Netherlands. Doesn't that sound like, I don't know, here? If you've been tracking the educational experience in America, it should sound like your hometown. In the States, Machen highlights the same issue, but concludes that confessional Christian schools must be the answer. Secular school teachers teaching the Bible in government school with its ethical contents, taught apart from its redemptive core, will lead children to think they can be good without God's grace. West writes in that same article, what the public schools and many Christian schools too had created was a garbled collection of religious and moral ideas. What Machen called for was a cohesive system of Christian doctrine, one that logically connected foundational truths such as man's utter depravity and God's absolute holiness. The answer for Machen and Kuyper was what they called principled or confessional pluralism. Those around them, especially in the early 20th century, ensconced secular modernist religion in public and private schools. Their version of pluralism and emphasis on moral neutrality produced conformity and a hostile environment for Christians. So Machen and Kuyper advocated a confessional pluralism which cultivated freedom and truth without sacrificing either principle. I don't know how many schools can really do that, the same kind of pluralism that Machen and Kuyper sought, but their concerns were valid and drove home the point that Christian faith taught in Christian schools must be consistent with a tradition's doctrine and practice, and maybe at the bare minimum, just not be discriminatory in the making fun of everybody else sense. So today, there are lots of Christian schools that belong to denominations or confessions that do not live out the doctrine and practice of their confessions. They've adopted a version of Christianity essentially unmoored from their tradition, perhaps in a misguided effort to appeal to those in the community around them. The issue with this approach is the same as what West intimated. You'll find in these schools a garbled collection of religious and moral ideas. I'm going to pick on my own church body. Last spring, I participated in an accreditation site visit at a Lutheran high school for the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod's National Lutheran School Accreditation. Unwittingly, they put me in charge of evaluating curriculum and whether or not it matched what the school said about itself. They're called validation visits. In talking with the pastor on staff in charge of theological education, I discovered that at this Lutheran high school, they did not teach anything from the small catechism at all, or the creed, because that would be confusing. Instead, they use words like connected, which isn't found in the catechism or the creed, or in any Christian writings prior to, 1975. But it'd be confusing to talk about the creed. They taught theology from buzzwords. Why? A majority of the students weren't Lutheran. They wouldn't understand Lutheran terminology. So I said, at some point, those students didn't even know the words you're using. So what's the difference? Introducing words that Christians have always used or introducing new words? There isn't one. The Christianity believed and taught at that school was very far from what Lutherans believe, teach, and confess. And the proof was in the pudding. You could not recognize that school as Lutheran. Not even the faculty really could. This leads me to the Association of Classical Christian Schools Good Soil Study. If you haven't looked at this, it's on their website. You can read it. And like all analyses of statistics, the person doing the analysis is in charge. But the analysis and the story that these statistics tell show that students who go to very intentionally Christian classical schools actually act, behave, and live like intentional Christians at a greater percentage than all the rest of us who've been homeschooled, who've been at evangelical schools, at private prep schools, at Catholic schools, and at public schools. And there's chart after chart after chart. They do it in 7 different profiles or categories: college and career, outlook on life, Christian practice, Christian life, traditional and conservative views, independent thinkers, and people who go on to be influencers. Alumni were surveyed from all kinds of schools from the ages of 23 to 44. So very large sample, and they pulled from all sorts of different places, asking them about their belief in God, how happy they were with their lives. And those from ACCS schools, that is classical Protestant schools, confessional schools, they were those who were best prepared for college, who were fulfilled by their faith, and even understood that suffering was part of God's plan, not victimhood. That their suffering was part of God's plan for them. They had less doubts about their faith. They were more regular in the practice of their faith. They went to church more often. They're also more likely to read the Bible on their own and religious literature in general, even more than homeschoolers, which is saying something because of, stereotypes. The story that can be taken from the Good Soil Report is a great delight for those who want to support and endeavor to have classical Christian education. The hard work of running schools that hand over the truth of Christian doctrine with a rigorous classical education finds its fruit in the lives of its students in the long run. What the Good Soil Report provides is some level of statistical confirmation of what most classical homeschoolers, educators, enthusiasts know predominantly from anecdotes and from experience. When you have a confessional classical education, you are handing over the Christian faith to the next generation. What does it mean to teach the Christian faith? We hand over this faith in a way that develops confidence, a stronger faith, a genuine Christian identity. It's true because teaching the Christian faith needs to be done intentionally, It occurs in your school's culture, in its curriculum, and in its worship life. It ought to permeate the school and not appear or feel like it's just one subject among many. I make jokes about public schools plus Jesus for most of education that exists today in the Christian environment. The Christian faith is how God delivers his gifts to us and enlivens us to live the Christian life. Now, depending upon your confession, the specifics will look differently. I'm going to talk about confessional Lutheranism, so if just picture somebody else's catechism, if you need to, and some other form of traditional chapel. But I'm going to go through all those things. So Lutherans use the term catechesis when it comes to teaching Christians who they are and what the content of their faith is. Lutherans teach these basics in the small catechism. Lutheran schools commit this small catechism to memory from a very young age. We recite the whole thing incrementally, preschool all the way up. By fourth grade, our students are done memorizing the catechism. We keep on doing it, and we use the Spanish translation for our Spanish high school class. I haven't yet done the Latin in Latin class, but I'm tempted. And this gives all students a common structure and basis from which to do theology. That's the point of a catechism. Everybody gets the common basis. So pick your catechism and don't change it. You could take that from Luther if you take nothing else. Don't change the words. Do the same thing over and over again, even if your publishing house tells you to change them. So students learn the 10 Commandments this way. They learn the Creed. They learn the Lord's Prayer. They learn about baptism, confession, and the Lord's Supper. Other traditions have their catechisms, and some teachers write their own catechisms for their classes. It's a Josh Gibbs technique, where every class he has, they recite the same thing every class to gain the basics of that class. Classical confessional schools should intentionally catechize their students and their families. Non-Lutherans attend our school. Non-Christians attend our school. We're probably 30 to 40% Lutheran in K to 11th. But everybody memorizes the catechism. They don't get sort of a religious exemption on their memory work, and they can't show up late to chapel. It's 8:45. It's the second thing. They'd be really late to school because we start at 8. So we do chapel at 8:45. We have it every day. We don't have it once a week. It's every day. And everybody comes. Doesn't matter what your faith is. And we find that even amongst mixed families, for example, we have a conservative Episcopalian wife and a agnostic Jewish father, because we are traditional, conservative, morally based, teaching their children foundational truths. Both of them are very happy. You wouldn't really imagine that, but they're very happy. They love having their girls at our school. So catechesis doesn't stop with memorizing the catechism. Worship life is key to training Christians in their faith. This should take the shape of your confession and tradition. Confessional Lutherans have a very distinctive view of worship life. It doesn't look Protestant, and since the Roman Catholics keep changing, it also doesn't look Catholic. Regardless of your faith and your confession, you should practice the faith that teaches the faith in your confession, which is why we pray matins and morning prayer. And this year, because we have 14 communicant high school kids, plus all of our faculty is Lutheran, we have communion every Wednesday because it suits our community. If you're an Anglican, you should use your appropriate Book of Common Prayer. If you're a Roman Catholic, you should use the Faithful Missal. You can find one. It has to be in Latin, I guess. Orthodox Presbyterians should sing the Psalms. Families who desire classical Christian education from inside and outside your church will support you in this. If you're a homeschooler, there are lots of ways in which the family altar can be done in a very positive way at home. Those who desire a different confession for their children will look for a different school. If you, being Lutheran, Reformed, Roman Catholic, makes them upset, they'll leave. But there are plenty of schools that are doing this that don't have only one denomination or another. Lots of people are drawn to solid confessional teaching. You need to be faithful to your confession in the training of your children and in the running of your school. You could pursue principled pluralism in the hiring of your faculty. As a Lutheran, we only hire Missouri Synod Lutherans to teach in our school. We admit students of all faiths, Christian and non-Christian, But as regards the teacher, I would think in running a school, the difference of theology would be hard in the faculty. Other Protestants may feel differently, but we Lutherans are more persnickety, I guess. Um, in handing over the Christian faith, the regular study of the catechism and the implementation of confessional worship are part and parcel to the teaching of the Christian faith. And most Christian confessions have their own musical tradition that can expand beyond chapel and in chapel. The Lutherans get to claim Bach and Schütz and Scheidt, names you may not know, Pachelbel, you know his wedding song, and Buxtehude, and plenty others. The Anglican tradition is rich in its psalm settings. Lutherans have stolen some of those, as well as choral music. The Roman Catholic tradition has Vivaldi. I mean, you have the Red Priest, plus the Baroque and the Renaissance and the classical periods. The 20th century is pretty hairy for most confessions because of modernism, but the robust practice of singing the faith belongs in the classical confessional school. And last but not least, right, you've noticed I talked about the catechism and chapel and singing, but not about the Bible. So they should be led in studying the scriptures and your confessions. A rich and historical approach to the scriptures will give all students a good biblical basis. And while studying the scriptures, the confessions of your denomination should be embraced and interwoven into the curriculum, especially as they get older. Lutherans should take their high school students through the Book of Concord. Calvinists should read Calvin and Beza. Roman Catholics should read Bellarmine, if you still agree with him, and Joseph Ratzinger. And you should. You should read those who fit your tradition. Now let's go to anecdotal evidence of the work of different confessions in living out classical education. There are lots of practical applications. There's the Society for Classical Learning, there's CIRCE, there's the Classical Academic Press, Memoria Press, Logos Press, Veritas Press, Classical Conversations, Well-Trained Mind. The past 20 years have done wonders for resources of Christians trying to teach classically at home and in the school. But three traditions I'm going to focus on have implemented intentionally confessional institutions in the past 40 years. The first is the Reformed under the leadership of Doug Wilson. And I say leadership in a broad sense. It isn't that everybody who's ACCS sends Doug Wilson a thank you note every year. But I consider it all sort of his empire ideologically. Canon Press, Logos Press, it's one of the earliest arrivals on the scene. Doug Wilson's work is viewed as the trailblazing and pioneering effort that kicks off the neoclassical Renaissance in the 1980s. Few leaders in the classical movement also are more confessional than Doug Wilson. He's a dyed-in-the-wool Calvinist. He calls himself a Chestertonian Calvinist, which is interesting, but he makes fun of Lutherans for wearing cassock and surplice. So he's a Calvinist. But his work has created many significant institutions within the broader movement. So you have Logos School in 1981 and Logos Press. Wilson's book, The Lost Tools of Learning, based off of Sayer's essay, has made everybody talk about grammar school and logic school and rhetoric school in a different paper. We Lutherans make fun of that now, but that's besides the point. He's had a huge effect on classical education. He was instrumental, amongst others, in founding the Association of Classical Christian Schools. That was in '94. And the ACCS accredits schools. It hosts conferences. He also helped found New St. Andrews College in Moscow, Idaho, which is an integrated single curriculum classical school in the world of higher education. They also translate Reformed works as like part of their curriculum. So when you do your final papers, you're translating things from Latin. There's a lot to be learned from them. The strong confessional principle of Wilson and those with whom he has worked in the past 40 years has wrought a ton of fruit in the renaissance of classical education. Now, if you know about classical education, you probably don't think about Roman Catholics. First and foremost, there are some Roman Catholics involved, but not as a group, because we're used to thinking of Catholic schools, diocesan schools as a large system. It's the largest system in the United States. Most of their schools are progressive, just like public schools. And the 20th century wasn't very helpful for them in terms of faithfulness to traditional Roman Catholicism. But there were two anecdotal examples that show Roman Catholic devotion to the resuscitation of classical ed. The first is in Houston. It is north of I-10. It's inside the Sam Houston Tollway, which none of you probably know about, but it's a very healthy school for boys. 3rd through 8th grade, you have to read to be able to go to the school. It's called Western Academy. They also didn't give me anything for talking about them. They're not affiliated with the local diocese. They are a non-diocesan school. They're actually served by priests of the prelature of Opus Dei, ultra-traditionalists. This school describes itself as a liberal arts school, but all the traditional marks of a classical education are found within their walls. They teach the great books, and their all-male faculty studies the great books. They teach Latin, and they have a very robust boy culture. When you drive up to the campus, they're hanging off trees in their uniforms. I mean, it's take summer camp, prep school, classical education, Roman Catholicism, and that's Western Academy. The second anecdote is also kind of outdoorsy, and it's Wyoming Catholic in Lander. Wyoming Catholic College was founded in 2005. They have 200 students, which is actually about the same size as Western Academy. They have over 200 boys. It's a very popular school. People are really looking for that. They've started a girls' school too, Magnolia. Doesn't seem to have the same draw yet, but Western has a very strong draw for people looking for raising of real men. Their alumni are called the Old Boys Club. Their alumni are all 13, right? Because they go to 8th grade, but they've embraced it, and they do a good job with it. This is true of WCC, of Wyoming Catholic. It's explicitly Roman Catholic. If you look at their website, it is everything about it. They have Corpus Christi parades and pictures of them on the main page in student life. It has an integrated curriculum, just like New St. Andrews, so no majors. It's not college like you're used to. It's the way of the old way of doing college from a very, very long time ago, and it has a very forward focus on the outdoors. There's much to admire about Wyoming Catholic's approach to student life, education, and their faith. They also have a zero tolerance policy on technology. It's meant to be a colloquium where the students are all talking to each other, learning the same things and conversing and growing in their faith. Which is why there's going to be Luther Classical for Lutherans, frankly, right? Like the Reformed in Idaho, the Roman Catholics have taken their confession seriously and have successfully implemented a classical and Roman Catholic higher education. Now, clearly I know the most about the Lutherans because that's where I live. In the age of the revival, Pastor Bill Heine and Joel Brandos, and a name known pretty well outside of the Lutheran Church, Dr. Gina Edward Veith, were instrumental in the creation of the Consortium for Classical Lutheran Education. It began with small schools in Wyoming and in Colorado in the early 90s. By 99, they hosted their first conference with, say, 20 or 30 people. It was originally called the Consortium for Classical and Lutheran Education. Now, we got rid of the "and" about a decade ago. It's the CCLE. The first several annual conferences were small, but they were full of dedicated pastors and homeschoolers and teachers. In 2006, the organization changed hands from Joel Brandos to the now Reverend Steve Kieser, who's the chairman, and Dr. Veith. Bill Heine came in as a permanent board member. Mrs. Dr. Veith joined up to create the accreditation process that we have, as well as now certification for teachers and administrators. And the whole organization continued to grow. It was a slow growth, pretty Lutheran in that sense. It just took a long, long time. The first 20 plus years of its existence, it was volunteerism, resulting in curriculum resource guides, a journal for papers from the conferences, school accreditation, certification, contests that fostered classical culture, essay and recitation and penmanship. In the past 4 or 5 years, that 30 to 50 to 100 conference attendance has grown. Over 275 adults and children attended our conference in Fort Wayne. In fact, we had a waiting list because the venue was smaller. And so now we only hold the conference at places that can support a full children's program because it's a family organization. So the kids essentially go to like a classical summer camp while the parents are in sessions. And that's how we run the thing. The CCLE has 7 board members. It now has an executive director. And Mrs. Anna Martin is helping push the organization where it should go in the same vein as things like the Association of Classical Christian Schools, Society for Classical Learning, etc. We have 18 schools in the CCLE. Most of them are new schools because transitioning a school is very difficult. That's my school. We transitioned. Took us about 20 years. I came in at the very end of the transition, and now I could say we're done. The reassignment is complete. Affirmation, is that what it's called? Right? Where we affirm ourselves as classical, and the identity matches. Everything is the same there. So there are even online versions of our education. That's Wittenberg Academy. The classical tradition is part and parcel to Lutheranism. If you haven't read Tom Korchak's 2011 book, Lutheran Education from Wittenberg to the Future, that traces the history. Most of our CCLE ventures are K-8 schools, and now some offer high school, Faith in Plano, our school, Memorial in Houston, Mount Hope in Casper, and Wittenberg Academy. And 2 years ago, we had the establishment of the board of Luther Classical College. The brother of Samuel Preuss, who is here, the Reverend Dr. Christian Preuss, pastor of Mount Hope Lutheran Church and School in Casper, and 12 like-minded men, pastors and laity, formed this board in the fall of 2020. It's an official 501c3. You can donate to them if you like Lutheranism. And as you heard yesterday, it sets itself up as a Lutheran New St. Andrews, a Lutheran Wyoming Classical. True to form, this should exist. There are other Reformed and Roman Catholic and Lutheran institutions of higher learning, but there are no classical Lutheran institutions of higher learning. They've been irrevocably influenced by progressive education. Our Concordias try. Mequon, River Forest, Irvine, and Seward all have classical programs of some stripe, but they're all universities that go beyond their original intention. And I can say this because I went to a Concordia that's dead. So I'm claiming my victimhood status. LCC opens in 2025, and it is more than a worthwhile effort at establishing the next step in the reestablishment of classical Lutheran education. Among the anecdotes, the lived legacy of classical confessional education in America, it simply makes sense. We can't stop at 8th grade. We can't stop at 12th grade. We need to do something in the world of higher ed. These are not the only stories of confessional Christians contributing to the expansion of classical education that can be told. Today, we move to our conclusions and where we need to go next. If we agree in our generation that our children need a different education than most of us received, except for the 5 hands who were classically trained, we need to be intentional in providing that education. If there's a Christian school connected with the church you go to, we have to start having conversations with that school, with the school board, with the teachers, with the pastor, in order to get it to be a classical school. You should study this book, Battle for the American Mind, and this one. Again, no royalties were given to me. Serpents in the Classroom by Tom Korchak. This is very good for talking to teachers about how their education has been theologically influenced by Piaget, Vygotsky, Montessori, etc. These are very good. I wouldn't start here unless you're trying to convince the teachers. I'd start here. You could also start here, an oldie but a goodie, Classical Education Movement Sweeping America. It's a fine place to go. But all of those will prime the pump for conversation. Christian schools that are grounded in the confessions of their denomination need an education with which it will not consistently and constantly be at odds. Transitioning a school is really hard. The CCLE has a guide, the ACCS has a guide of how a school can transition to be classical. The process can take a very long time. Like I said, memorials took 20 years for various reasons. Others might be able to transition more smoothly. If people get really upset and leave, you can bring in new teachers or new families. But it takes a while. Thankfully, there are many factors today that have caused devout Christians to pay more attention to how their kids are educated. For the Lutherans in the room and anybody who cares, that's the handout, how to hand over a classical Lutheran culture. You could retype it and put Christian if you want. My point in doing that was to show that we can't just teach our kids classically during the school day and then let them watch TikTok at home. We have to hand over a culture that the parents understand, that the students understand, that the teachers understand, that is holistic, that covers all of it, that actually inclines what the kids love and what they desire. Otherwise, someone else is going to do it for you, right? So we need to take that opportunity to do it. If you are not associated with a church that has a school, see how you can start one. It's not for the faint at heart, but growing and learning in community and sharing that labor is efficient to get lots of families involved, especially those who may not be able to homeschool. If they're stuck in the pattern of two working parents or whatever it might be, developing in community is very helpful. It might have to begin as a homeschool co-op, a university model school. It might only ever be homeschooling families, but classical confessional education is the answer to the myriad of educational problems that rear their ugly head in every generation over the past century, and especially here. If you can't do these things because you don't have children or you don't have school-age children anymore, then you should support the efforts of those who do. You should pray for them. You should become a teacher for your church's classical schools. You should donate to the organizations that promote this education, all the appropriate ones. I don't have to panhandle today. You could help start Luther Classical. You could give money to the ACCS or to the CCLE or to the SCL to ensure that future generations have the opportunity to receive an education that actually hands over the Christian faith. There are many ways to help the cause. It is an important and significant struggle. And as with pretty much everything we've talked about today, the devil opposes efforts by Christians, as well as the coming of God's kingdom, that is, to live lives by God's word here in time and there in eternity. So it is important that we do not trust the old ways, that is, the progressive ways. We must educate our children faithfully. There are many ways to help, and there are many manifestations. There are brick and mortar, there is homeschool. We've said it all. What is important is that we as Christians unite around our confessions. We teach in accordance with them as we raise up our children, because the need has been urgent for a long time. We have neglected the fullest meaning as a culture of training a child up in the way he should go, and he will not depart from it. In fact, through our complacency as churches and as Americans, we've done it. It's just that we didn't pick the right way. We've trained them up in the way they should go, but it wasn't the one we were supposed to. It is high time that we replace that way with an older way, a more steadfast way, a Christ-centered and a classical way that prepares children to lead godly lives here in time and there in eternity. And there is no better way than that. Thank you.
Thank you for that. You made a claim at the beginning of your talk, I think, that a classical education must be Christian, and then that it can't happen in a charter school or something like that. So I teach at an ACCS school, and I'm also in graduate school at the University of Dallas, which, if you're not familiar, is a conservative Catholic school. It's largely behind the Great Hearts charter schools in Texas and Arizona, and I'm sure they're looking to expand elsewhere. It would be similar to maybe Hillsdale's Barney Charter School Initiative. So both of these publicly funded classical schools. And so I hear a lot of the, classical need not be sectarian types of claims. I was just wondering, could you speak a little bit more to that? What would be your best kind of 30-second pitch for why must classical be Christian?
Well, first of all, if an education isn't Christian, there's no point in giving it to Christians, right? And I care about the not yet baptized, but I care the most about educating Christians, my children and those who've been given to me. Also, what is the point of being human, right? Ultimately, we believe that it is to receive those gifts of God and then love our neighbor as ourselves. How do you do that if you're just teaching them about Cicero? How do you do that if you have to gut out the whole synthesis of the classical tradition, right? I mean, if you can't even teach about Augustine and what Augustine believed, then how do you get to classical education in the 20th century? You have to stop and only teach what existed before the Middle Ages. I think the problem is we can't redeem the old institutions. The government schools need to be abandoned by Christians. Um, uh, they're not for us, and they weren't for us in the beginning. Christians set up their own schools, and eventually the devil got to them too. I mean, look at Harvard, right, and Yale, and Princeton, and they're Christian schools at one point in time. Look at the universities of Europe. So, because of the nature of the Christian faith, I don't think we can just say there's a way to be classical without it. And if there is, I don't know that a Christian should want it. So, I mean, I guess pagans who want to be virtuous could send their kids to charter schools that are part of Great Hearts. But I don't want kids to come to our school so they can be good people. I want kids to come to our school so they can receive Jesus. And then Jesus works good things through them as a result. Again, that's probably sectarian, but Jesus didn't come to bring peace. He came to bring a sword. So you bring the sword. And if they don't like it, it's a free country for now.
You spoke about completing your transition, and I'm just curious at what point there will be some data to show whether you're happy with your transition, your school's transition. We want to measure these things, Rob. Okay, we're eagerly awaiting it.
Just wait. That would be, let's see. We're out of the honeymoon phase. We're out of the honeymoon phase. It would have been the 18-19 school year that I could say we got to finish transitioning, and we feel very comfortable in our body.
Thank you very much. How does, speaking specifically to Lutherans, how does CCLE help districts or congregations in forming classical Lutheran schools?
We have in our plans the idea of being consultants. Currently, we don't do it formally, but we do it anyway. So what I would do is in a district, in a church, you reach out to CCLE, you reach out to me and others like me, and I can get you in contact with people in your region, and we hold a conference. For example, CCLE is hosting its annual conference in Concordia, Seward, this upcoming summer. One of the profs at Concordia Seward is helping to start a classical Lutheran high school on the campus of Seward. So they're hosting a pre-conference in October to generate excitement and hand over what's important about a classical Lutheran education. So I think what you do is you do town halls, you get people like the CCLE to come and talk. You get book lists, you read with people who can read, and then you do wine and cheese and talking for the rest. And that's actually classical, right? Talking about good things, having good food and drink at the same time. Skole, something we do at our school. So that's the first. You do not want to, we're going to keep doing the transition thing. You don't want to rush. You can't rush because people need to realize the urgency. And if they aren't there yet, it takes them a little while. Now, the nice thing is the culture has primed a lot of these discussions in a way that when the movement started in the 80s and 90s, people were still fat and happy, and especially in the early 2000s. Now, they're a lot less fat and happy, and they are more likely to say, wow, that's a bad public school, even if they don't realize that all public schools are bad, because they're all doing the wrong thing. Everybody who's involved in the system, right, does the best they can. But the progressive system has always not had Christian goals in mind. So conversation, bringing people in to talk. Steve Kieser, Pastor Kieser, who's the head of the CCLE, has done a lot of these. I went, a new classical high school started in Wichita, Lutheran Classical High School. They had a big dinner and invited people to come and talk sort of multiple years in a row to get people excited. You do those sorts of things, you develop personal relationships. But the more we can get in with ed execs, the better. Most of the time, if you're working into systems, you will find that people are pretty hardened in the way they've always done things. The nice thing about areas that may not have your confession or may not have a ton of tradition of schools in your confession is that that's an open door. That's an open door to say, we have a better school than you've ever heard of, because they've never heard of a Lutheran school, right? Or a Reformed school. They haven't heard of that. So you can go in and give them this great product. It's a lot harder to do in Indiana for Lutherans, or frankly, in Texas for Lutherans. It is more difficult because there is a reputation outside.
Thank you, Reverend Paul.
You got it.